Vectorworks has two broad categories of textures, or materials as they're called in some other programs, and that's stock textures and custom textures. We'll start by talking about the stock textures. There are two ways of accessing the stock textures, either through the Resource Manager or through Object Info. We'll start with Object Info. If you select an object, and then in Object Info click on the Render tab, there will be a texture drop-down that can either be set to none, class texture, or texture. None is self-explanatory, I hope. Textures can be set for entire classes, so if your object is in a class and that class has a texture assigned to it, then that texture will be assigned to the object. Or you can directly say to assign a texture to an object. When you do that, you'll get a drop-down of the basically a mini version of the Resource Manager. If you click on the first on the file that you're in, you should see the textures that are currently in your document. You will probably have these box textures from the first week's video, the 6-sided box, because evidently I forgot to clean them out before I created the template, but at any rate, there they are. So if there are any, these are textures that are currently in your document, and then underneath that you'll have a couple of menu items. Service Select Libraries is only available if you are paying the subscription to Vectorworks. You should all have Vectorworks libraries, and when you open that, you should get a list of all of the default textures, or all of the stock textures actually, that are in the document, and it's fairly extensive. So I'm just going to sort of randomly pick one. Let's pick concrete. So if I pick concrete, then I here in the browser part, you get thumbnails of the different textures that are available in that file, and then you can simply double click on that texture to apply it to the object. Once you've done that, you have some options of mapping type, and perimeter wraps the texture around the perimeter of the object. Plane applies the texture to one plane of the object, and you can, with a tool in the tool set, specify which plane, but then it sort of it pushes the texture through the object from that plane, so, which is usually not what you want, but sometimes if you're applying an object to a flat plane or something, that's appropriate. Auto align plane looks similar to perimeter, only instead of wrapping the texture around the instrument, the object, it individually applies the texture to each plane of the object, so it just sort of repeats on each plane. Sphere is used for spheres, so if I put this texture on this sphere in sphere mode, that's what it looks like. If I put it on in plane mode, you can see that it sort of distorts. I'm not sure what auto align plane will do. Yeah, it's not helpful. And then cylindrical mode you see what it does to a sphere. If I put this texture on a cylinder, probably cylinder mode is what interestingly enough. So sometimes it's it doesn't do exactly what you would think that it would, and you have to play around with it. But at any rate, let's change this back to perimeter. So you can set the different map types. You can adjust the scale of the texture, so I'm going to make this twice as large as it was. The offset moves it around, so you can just watch. If I change this to 0 and that to 0, the texture moves. So you can use that to place the texture on the object. You can rotate it, and you'll notice, interestingly, how it's rotating sort of differently on the different faces of the object. You can set it to not repeat or repeat. This particular texture is not seamless, which is and I can tell that by looking at the sphere, where you can see this seam here. So a seamless texture would wrap around without showing a seam. So you can flip vertically, you can flip horizontally. So you have some choices here in the way the texture can be applied to the object. One thing that Vectorworks does not have, which can be frustrating at times, is something that's called UV mapping, which has nothing to do with ultraviolet light. It's two additional axes, because we've already used X, Y, and Z. UV is referring to the individual axis of the face of an object. So in some programs, Maya, for example, you can unwrap the object and get a flat version of it, and then create a texture, basically paint the texture or Photoshop, however you do it, onto that flattened version of the object, and then rewrap the texture around the object. Unfortunately, you can't do that in Vectorworks. The closest you can come to that is if you have an object that has distinct sides and top and bottom. Here you can apply different textures to the top, the bottom, and the sides. So in this case of this box, basically, that makes sense. That wouldn't make any sense for a sphere. It would make a little bit of sense for a cylinder. So if you have really regular geometric objects, then this is useful. But if you're trying to create very detailed textures for very complex objects, you're going to be frustrated by the texturing abilities in Vectorworks. Depending on the properties of the individual texture, many textures are greatly affected by the rendering mode. These particular textures will not be. If we look at this in a RenderWorks style, you're not going to see a lot of difference in the textures. But if we look at something like glass or metal, and anything that has reflection or transparency or both, you'll see a radical difference. So let's find, let's say, a glass texture and apply it. How about just plain old glass? There we go. So in OpenGL, you can see that it looks transparent, but it certainly doesn't look much like glass. It just looks like a transparent cube, basically. But if we look at this in a rendering style, you'll see that it looks a lot more like glass. Let's try another. Let's try a metal. So I'm going to go to metals and polished brass. So in OpenGL, polished brass just looks yellow. If we go to a rendering mode, you'll see that it looks much more metallic because of the reflections. So just be aware that when you're working in OpenGL, you often won't see the real effect of the texture. You'll have to go into one of the rendering modes. The other way to apply textures is to use the Resource Manager. So if you go to the Resource Manager and open Vectorworks libraries, defaults, RenderWorks textures, it will show you the entire list of available stock textures. You could also do a search in the Resource Manager. So wood, let's say, it will return all of the different textures. And you can set it here to just look for textures. RenderWorks textures, yeah, there we go. It will return all the different textures that respond to the word that you searched for, and then you can just drag one of them onto an object. And it may ask you where to put it. You might want to put them in the textures folder. Then after you've applied it, you have the same controls in object info that you do if you apply the texture straight through object info. So there's just two different ways of managing and looking for textures. The Resource Manager is also where we go to create custom textures. So in the Resource Manager, there's a button called New Resource, and if you click on that, you get a whole list of things that you can create. RenderWorks Texture is one of them, so we're going to select RenderWorks Texture and click Create, and then you get this dialog box, and there are a variety of different things that you have control over. The first of which is color. So you can just set a solid color. You can import an image and use that as the color. For now, it sets two different colors, so it sort of blends from center to the edges. Bricks are sort of self-explanatory, and you can change the different components of the bricks. I will say that the brick shader gives you very computer generated looking bricks. If you want realistic bricks, what you need is a photograph of actual bricks as an image to be brought in. So these things will give you very sort of computer looking shaders, but just be aware that this is where you set these things, and the two most common ones are image or color. Object attribute is an interesting one that will leave the color of the image that the texture is applied to as is, and just apply the other three shaders. So whatever color the object is without the texture, if the texture is set to object attribute, that's what color the object will be. With the texture applied, then all of the other things will also be applied to it. So for instance, sometimes I have a texture that's just called shiny. So I'll set the texture to be shiny, but I won't give it a particular color, so that anything I have in the document that I want to be shiny, I can apply that texture to, and I don't have to have different ones for different colors. So that's what color does. Speaking of shiny, reflectivity controls reflections, or shine, if you will, and this is better seen, and this is the preview here in the spherical preview. So if none has, it's just a flat white sphere. Plastic, you can see it starts to get shiny. There are metallic. I did know that there are metallic shaders. You can edit those. There are different options here, and then you can edit the options. You notice this is slightly rough gold. I could make this into very smooth gold. There also are built-in stock metallic textures, so this is useful if you're creating something on your own and you want to start with one of the presets and then fiddle with it to create your own texture. Cloth. It's sort of like denim, I guess. There are different patterns that you can use. So you can play with that. Mirror is. You're not going to see anything here because there's nothing for it to reflect, but it does what you would imagine. It creates the reflection. Glow is an interesting one. Glow is basically is sort of a lighting texture. What glow does is, if it's applied to an object, no matter what the lighting in the scene is, that object is always at 100%. So it it appears to glow. So if you're trying to create a neon and you extrude a tube and apply the glow texture to it, it will appear to glow. Glow is often applied to lampshades and that sort of thing. We'll be using glow to create a backdrop behind our room in this week's project. Rather than creating a backdrop and trying to light it, we'll just set the backdrop to glow. So glow is useful. Glass, it has all sorts of options for glass. Backlit is for things that need to be translucent. So if you have a screen that someone's standing behind, you need to see their shadow, then backlit is useful. And then there are some other reflection-based options here. Transparency, you can set just plain transparency. This is easier seen with the cube. If I turn the glow off, so you can see that just creates plain transparency. You can set transparency according to an imported image. You can create a transparency mask. We'll be working with these things in the hotel lobby project, so we'll get more familiar with the transparency shader. And then the bump shader applies sort of quote unquote real texture to the texture. So this is a little bit hard to see, but let me see if I bump this up. So noise, I'm gonna make this 100%. And you can see that there are different, there we go. Let's see what that does. You can see how that applies sort of a texture to the texture, basically. So with the combination of all of these things, you can create pretty much any texture you want, except for a texture that is specifically tailored to wrap around a oddly shaped object, which is not something that Vectorworks does. Since it's essentially a architectural rendering program, it doesn't have the UV mapping, unfortunately. Size, this is where you set the size of the texture. So right now this is set to 1 inch. If I change this to 12 inches, you'll see how it gets much larger, and you can change the size of the preview. This part right here has nothing to do with the actual texture. This is just showing you what the texture looks like. So changing anything here doesn't change anything about the texture. It just changes the preview. So there are lots of different combinations here, and we will be using some of them and in the projects. I found that the best way to learn about the textures is just to create some and play around with them and see what they do. So you can't break anything. I don't think. Let's hope not. Let's hope you can't break anything by doing this. It might depend on your computer. So that's a brief introduction to textures, and we will actually create some textures and apply some lighting in our room in this week's project.